40 feet below Gene Hackman's private library, an FBI agent's flashlight landed on something that brought him to a dead halt, an iron door. No handle, no exterior hinges, just rivets, rust, and a bead of weld tracing every seam like an old wound. Somebody had sealed that door from the inside, and that was decades ago, and nobody ever walked back out. Whatever the Bureau pulled from the darkness waiting behind it was never meant to see the light of day, and what it exposes about one of Hollywood's most guarded men will completely change how you understand the final 30 years of his life. The Breach. February 26, 2025. Just after 11 in the morning, a small convoy of federal vehicles pulled up to a towering set of reinforced steel gates tucked deep inside the Pinon forests on the outskirts of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Behind those gates stood a $4 million compound, the private estate of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, classical pianist Betsy Arakawa. Nobody had seen or heard from either of them in days. Phone calls went unanswered. Staff were turned away at the gate. Complete silence from a property that, under normal conditions, ran with the precision of a small military base. It wasn't a family member, a close friend, or law enforcement who eventually sounded the alarm. It was a handyman. He told deputies he was convinced the couple had died inside. The gates had to be forced open. Locks had to be cut through. That detail alone told the responding agent something wasn't right. This was not a place where someone carelessly left the door unlatched. Every aspect of that compound was built to remain shut unless someone from within chose to open it. When officers finally crossed onto the property, they expected something tragic but unremarkable. Two elderly people passing away quietly in seclusion. That is not what they walked into. The bodies of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were found inside the mansion, along with the body of their dog. Investigators would later confirm that Betsy had passed away roughly a week before Gene. Her cause of death was listed as a severe viral infection. His was recorded as heart failure with contributing factors, natural causes, case closed on paper. But the scene did not match what was written down. Not by a long stretch. Here is where the entire story starts to fall apart. The Santa Fe Sheriff's Department told the public from the very beginning that there were no signs of foul play. That's standard language, the kind designed to put a story to rest before it gains momentum. But in that very same statement, they acknowledged the scene was suspicious enough to warrant a complete forensic sweep of the entire property. Read that again carefully. No foul play, yet suspicious enough to bring in federal teams equipped with thermal imaging technology and forensic specialists. Those two statements cannot coexist, and that contradiction is precisely where the story breaks wide open. The timeline alone raises questions that nobody has been willing to address publicly. Betsy died a full 7 days before Gene. That means Gene Hackman, a 95-year-old man, was alive inside that house with his wife's body for nearly a week. No call for help, no attempt to make contact with the outside world, not a single message sent by a man who, according to people close to him, still had the mental sharpness to hold a complete conversation just weeks before. What keeps a man silent for 7 days inside a house where someone he loved has already died? Fear? Duty? A grief so consuming it seals the throat shut? Or perhaps the understanding that calling for help would mean allowing strangers through the door, and strangers would discover what lay beneath. Before this goes any further, something needs to be stated plainly. If even half of what investigators documented below this estate is confirmed, this will stand as one of the most unsettling discoveries connected to a celebrity death in the modern history of this country. Sources have now obtained the official search warrant. What authorities found documented inside that property reaches far, far beyond a routine death investigation. Because concealed behind a wall inside Hackman's private library, federal agents encountered something none of the staff, the neighbors, or local law enforcement ever had any idea existed. A tunnel sealed for decades, and whatever had been locked inside it, someone had taken extraordinary measures to ensure it remained buried permanently. But the tunnel was not even the worst part. The worst of it was what had already been waiting down there. The fortress on the hill. Before you can grasp what the Bureau encountered underground. You need to understand what was standing directly above it. Gene Hackman's estate was not a home in any conventional meaning of the word. It was a compound. Thick woodland pressed in against every side of the grounds. Massive stone walls encircled the entire perimeter. Motion detectors covered every access point. Thermal imaging cameras, a round-the-clock surveillance system whose level of sophistication reportedly matched the perimeters of certain classified government installations. The staff had been hand-selected, rigorously screened, and bound under legal contracts drawn so tightly that not a single one of them has ever spoken on the record about what happened behind those walls. Just sit with that for a moment. Decades worth of employees, groundskeepers, housekeepers, private chefs, maintenance crews, personal security personnel, and not one leak, not a single anonymous comment. In an era of social media, where garbage collectors film celebrity trash cans for likes, that degree of silence does not happen on its own. It is manufactured. Local journalists who attempted to investigate the property's history over the years ran into the same barrier every single time. Building permit requests came back with entire passages blacked out. Property records contained gaps that no clerk could account for. One researcher from the Santa Fe Historical Society reportedly spent months pulling land documents connected to the estate, and then, without any warning, simply stopped answering calls, never put a single word into print. Nobody knows what she uncovered or who quietly persuaded her to stop looking. Step through those gates, however, and what lay inside was breathtaking. Hallways lined with original artistic masterworks, furniture stretching back centuries, pieces reportedly once belonging to European royal households, chandeliers rumored to have once hung in the corridors of ancient palaces, gardens filled with botanical specimens so uncommon they exist in fewer than a dozen recorded locations across the entire planet. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an architectural historian at the University of New Mexico, who later provided consultation on the property assessment, expressed it in terms that stuck. She said she had documented estates throughout the entire Southwest, and this one had been designed like a museum, constructed inside a military installation. The beauty was genuine, she said, but so were the countermeasures. That kind of combination does not come about unless someone is guarding something in particular. Body camera footage released only after an unusual public ruling by a New Mexico judge shows deputies making their way through the mansion during the hours following the discovery. The silence on the audio track is immediate and oppressive. But what unsettled the agents most was not that quiet. It was the clear evidence that someone had been moving through the house in the hours or days before officers ever arrived. Furniture dragged across hardwood flooring, books pulled off shelves and restacked in the wrong sequence, drawers left hanging open, a bedroom safe standing wide open and entirely cleaned out. Someone had been tearing through this house, either searching for something specific or making it disappear. And then the agents walked into the library and everything about the case shifted completely. The descending passage, hidden behind a particular section of wall in Hackman's private library, was concealed so precisely that a person could stand in that room 1,000 times and never notice a thing. Agents discovered a hidden mechanism, not a hinged bookcase, not a latch tucked behind a painting. This was an engineered entry point requiring a specific activation sequence before it would open at all. Whoever had it designed intended it to be completely invisible to anyone who did not already know precisely where and how to engage it. Beyond that mechanism, a narrow corridor opened up, stone steps dropping down into complete darkness. No light source, no detectable airflow, just a shaft of carved stone descending straight down into the earth beneath the property. The agents went down. The temperature dropped with every step they took. The air grew heavier, damp and metallic, carrying a taste of rust and something far older. Condensation clung heavily to the walls on every side. Their flashlight beams swept across the stone surfaces. And that was the moment the first wave of dread hit them. The walls were covered in markings, not graffiti, not ornamentation, but precise inscriptions carved with deliberate tools and clear intent. Some bore a resemblance to alchemical notation, Others appeared closer to technical blueprints for devices and mechanisms that, logically, should never have existed in whatever period this tunnel was first constructed. One stretch of wall displayed what seemed to be a schematic for a machine with no contemporary equivalent. Gears, chambers, conduits arranged in patterns that one forensic technician later described in his notes as engineering from nowhere, and the construction itself had its own story to tell. Near the library entrance, the stonework was clean, mid-20th century work. Industrial material, poured concrete reinforcement, straight, machine-cut edges. But the further the agents descended, the rougher the walls became. Hand-carved joints, crude reinforcement, tool marks consistent with pick and chisel rather than any powered equipment. Marcus Devlin, a structural engineer who reviewed leaked photographs of the passage interior for an independent assessment, estimated that the deepest sections could be over 100 years old, possibly considerably more. This was not constructed by the homeowner, Devlin said in an interview later suppressed through legal request. The upper section was renovated, modernized, reinforced, but the core of this tunnel was already here. Hackman moved into it. He inherited it. Then they reached the chamber, a vast underground space suspended in time. Ancient wooden crates stacked against the walls. Some had crumbled with age, spilling their contents across the stone floor. Yellowed documents, rusted metallic objects, artifacts that did not correspond to any identifiable era or origin. One agent lifted the lid of a dust-covered box and discovered photographs. Fragile, curling at the edges, faces no one could place, dressed in clothing from a century gone by. Some of those photos depicted what looked like clandestine gatherings in windowless rooms. Others captured locations, buildings, underground spaces that do not match any known place on official record. In one image, a group of men stood gathered around a table covered in maps. Their expressions were tight. A single overhead bulb threw hard shadows across their faces. On the back of the photograph, someone had carefully written a date in ink, 1937, and beside it, a single word in a language that has not yet been identified. Leather-bound files sat alongside the photographs, filled with coded dates, redacted names, and passages describing events that appear to have been deliberately scrubbed from the historical record. Some pages had been partially burned. Someone had made an attempt to destroy them, then either stopped of their own accord or was interrupted. Other documents carried watermarks and insignia tied to organizations that were officially dissolved decades ago. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Agents estimated that fully cataloging everything stored in that chamber could take years, possibly a full decade of careful conservation work by a team of specialists working in shifts. Some of the paper was so fragile, it began disintegrating the instant a gloved hand made contact. Other pages sealed inside oiled leather portfolios looked as though they had been written the week before. The difference in preservation quality suggested that whoever had last accessed the chamber knew precisely which materials were expendable and which were not. Among the recovered items were 3 separate ledgers, written in a mixture of Latin, French, and an unidentified script that linguists have so far declined to characterize publicly. There were maps depicting the American Southwest with borders and settlement patterns that match no recorded historical period. There were sealed glass vials, contents unknown, packed in straw. There were also, according to one leaked evidence log, 2 objects described only as instrument unidentified, do not open. But here is the part that nobody was prepared for. The photographs, the documents, the crates, all of it was merely unsettling. What was waiting at the far end of that chamber, behind everything else, was something of an entirely different order. The door that does not open, deep in the far wall of the chamber, past the crates and the scattered files, the agent's flashlights landed on it. An iron door set flush into the stone. No handle on the outside, no hinges you could spot, just a corroded steel surface with weld marks running along every single seam. Somebody had sealed that door from the inside, and they had gone out of their way to make sure it stayed that way. The lock was never meant to keep people from getting in. It was built to keep something from getting out. The FBI has made no public statements whatsoever about what lies on the other side of that door. Not one word. No official comment, no leak, no quiet background briefing passed along to some journalist. In an age where classified documents end up on Discord servers and internal surveillance footage hit social media within hours of an incident, that kind of containment simply does not happen on its own. It takes active, sustained suppression, and that alone tells you something important about what the Bureau is sitting on. Now here is where things get genuinely stranger. The floor of that chamber was not just dusty stone. It was inlaid with circular patterns, intricate, deliberate designs that, when viewed from above, resemble celestial maps. Star charts carved directly into the ground by someone who knew precisely what they were doing. Not random, not purely decorative. These patterns corresponded to specific astronomical alignments, constellations, planetary positions, orbital paths, all rendered with a level of precision that would demand advanced mathematical knowledge and careful instrumentation. Whoever put them there was not making guesses. They were mapping something or marking something for someone who would arrive later and know exactly how to read it. The tools recovered from the crates were equally out of place. Engravings matching no known manufacturer or time period. Internal mechanisms so finely made they would have required fabrication technology that simply did not exist when this tunnel was supposedly constructed. One particular device drew the attention of specialists. A palm-sized metal cylinder with rotating internal rings, apparently cast as a single piece with no visible seams or any obvious method of assembly. Even today, current metallurgical techniques struggle to replicate that kind of monolithic casting at that scale. Dr. James Whitfield, a former FBI forensic analyst who spent 19 years processing classified evidence before retiring, looked over the publicly available details and said something that has stuck with everyone who has heard it. When an agency goes this quiet this fast, Whitfield said, it usually means one of two things. Either they found nothing and they are embarrassed, or they found something so significant that the conversation about disclosure has moved well above the investigative team. I have seen both situations. This does not look like embarrassment, so what was Gene Hackman exactly? A man quietly gathering impossible artifacts, a keeper of knowledge that someone decided must never see the light of day? Or did he inherit this underground world from someone else, a burden that was simply passed down to him? The answer might be buried in the earth itself, and it might shed light on why he and Betsy never walked out of that house alive. The ground beneath Santa Fe. The land under northern New Mexico is nothing like what most people picture when they think of Santa Fe art galleries and desert sunsets. Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was born, sits just a short drive up the highway. The Manhattan Project, nuclear testing, black budget weapons research, all of it unfolded within easy commuting distance of Hackman's front gate. For decades, locals have passed around stories about underground transport systems, forgotten bunkers carved deep into the mesas, and infrastructure built to shelter government elites in the event of civilizational collapse. Freedom of Information Act requests have quietly confirmed that extensive underground construction did take place throughout this region during the peak of the Cold War. Just how extensive remains classified, but retired Department of Energy consultant Richard Payne, who worked on facility assessments across northern New Mexico during the 1990s, offered a chilling summary in a recorded interview. There are systems under those mesas that were built to outlast everything on the surface, Payne said. Some were decommissioned, some were sealed off, and some were simply abandoned, cut off from every official map and every classified record. They just went dark. Here is the piece that will not sit still. The iron door at the far end of Hackman's tunnel was anything but ornamental. The steel used was military grade. The spacing between rivets matched documented building methods found in high-security government facilities constructed during the 1950s. Nobody builds a wine cellar or a root cellar like a bank vault. But if this was a forgotten offshoot of a far larger government network quietly branching under the region, that changes the entire scale of what we are dealing with. The neighbors always sensed something was off. Margaret Calloway, who owned the property directly next to the estate for 22 years, still recalls the sounds, low-frequency vibrations at 2 or 3 in the morning. Not plumbing, not heating, she said. She mentioned it to Hackman once, casually across the property line while trimming a hedge. He gave her a look she says she still thinks about at night and told her simply, "Some things are better left below the surface." She laughed it off at the time. She does not laugh anymore. He initially assumed minor seismic activity. He was a scientist. He wanted a scientist's explanation. I set up a portable seismometer one summer just to convince myself I was imagining it, DeLamp told a reporter. The readings did not match any natural pattern. They were rhythmic, mechanical. Something was operating down there on a fixed schedule. He filed a formal noise complaint with the county in 2019. It was never followed up on. Others in the area remember unmarked trucks arriving after dark and departing before dawn, shadowy visitors, faces concealed, no invoices, no logos, no trace. Former staff who left the estate and simply disappeared from public life. Phones disconnected, social media erased, as though their existence had been quietly scrubbed clean. One housekeeper who worked the property in the early 2000s told a close friend before her own disappearance that she had witnessed things inside the house she was never meant to see. She refused to say what. She had vanished from the region within the month. Her forwarding address turned out to be a P.O. box in a town she had never lived in. Her sister, reached years later by a documentary researcher, said the family had received a single postcard from her in 2004, and nothing since. There is also the matter of the property's water consumption. A public utility record request filed by a local watchdog blog in 2021 revealed that the estate's water usage had been consistently and inexplicably higher than the size of the household could possibly account for. Enough to sustain a small commercial operation running below ground level. Enough, in other words, to service systems that nobody on the surface had ever laid eyes on, the ghost line. Here is a detail that has barely surfaced publicly, but ought to stop everyone cold. During renovations that first uncovered the tunnel entrance, workers discovered a secondary communications system hardwired directly into the estate's walls. Not a phone line, not an internet cable. A closed-circuit system that linked the main house straight to the underground chamber. Old wiring, predating modern telecommunications by decades, yet functional, maintained, and operational right up until the day the Bureau walked in. Someone had kept that line alive for years, communicating with whatever was down in that tunnel through a channel that could not be monitored, recorded, or intercepted by anyone outside. In a house already equipped with state-of-the-art digital surveillance, this system existed completely off the grid, a ghost line threading through the walls like a nervous system nobody was supposed to find. Who was on the other end of that line? What was so critical that it demanded a channel invisible to the rest of the world? The silence. The official account is that Gene Hackman died of heart failure at 95. Plausible on paper, but the paperwork does not explain why a couple with access to some of the finest private health care available isolated themselves so completely in their final days. No doctor calls, no emergency contacts, no staff on the premises. The perimeter alarm remained active, but the internal cameras had been manually switched off. Two people alone in a fortress, dying in silence, while a sealed underground vault sat 40 feet beneath them. The link between the tunnel and those deaths stays the most perplexing piece of this entire case. Were they eliminated because they knew too much? Did somebody use that passage to slip into the mansion without being noticed? Or had something shifted? Something that caused Hackman to finally understand that what he had spent his whole life protecting was no longer secure. And here is the detail that stays with every investigator who has ever touched this case. When agents discovered the tunnel entrance in the library, it had not been sealed. The mechanism had been triggered recently. Gene Hackman, a man well into his mid-90s, had gone down into that cold and damp corridor not long before his death. Why? What was he going to check on? What had frightened him? Or, and this is the question no one dares say aloud, was he hiding from something he knew had finally tracked him down? Here is what people tend to forget about Gene Hackman. Before he became a recluse, before the fortress and the walls of silence, he was one of the most genuinely warm presences American cinema had ever seen. His barber in Santa Fe told a local reporter that Hackman would come in every few weeks, settle into the same chair, and talk about Hemingway novels and the Kansas weather he had grown up around. He tipped double. He knew every employee's children by name. At the local farmer's market, vendors recognized him on sight. He would buy green chilies by the bulk and joke, with plenty of self-deprecation about his terrible Spanish. He donated to local literacy programs. He quietly wrote checks to a nearby animal shelter. This was not a man who retreated from the world because he had no use for people. He pulled back because something convinced him that he had no choice. Now, knowing what was sitting directly beneath his home, that decision carries a heaviness it never had before. From the French Connection all the way through Enemy of the State, Hackman built his career playing men caught inside conspiracies they had no way out of. Federal agents, Coppola's surveillance-obsessed paranoid figures in the conversation, journalists, investigators, whistleblowers, men embedded in the machinery of institutions far larger and older than they had ever imagined. Perhaps none of that was ever purely performance. Perhaps he understood things the rest of us were only ever observing from the outside. What happens from here? FBI forensic teams are reportedly still working beneath the property, going through every artifact, every document, every symbol carved into those walls. Trace DN. Analysis. Invisible residue detection. Cryptographic decoding of messages left on paper so fragile it crumbles at a touch. They have assembled specialists from fields that rarely overlap. Linguists, metallurgists, and even astronomers quietly brought in to interpret the star maps etched into the chamber floor. If those findings eventually point to specific names, specific organizations, specific historical events, this case does not simply make headlines. It explodes. But the authorities will not say a single word. Their statements are vague and carefully trimmed, clearly constructed to reveal nothing of substance. And that silence communicates far more than any press conference ever could. Sit with that for just a moment. We are now months past the original discovery. In any standard investigation, something leaks. Early findings, an unnamed source, background conversations with reporters over coffee. In this case, there has been nothing. Zero. The information blackout surrounding that tunnel is more airtight than anything wrapped around the deaths themselves. Which means whatever is down there is not simply historically significant. It is operationally sensitive right now. Someone, somewhere, made the call that the contents of that chamber are still dangerous enough today to require full containment. Not in 1950. Not during the Cold War. Today. Beneath the estates of the powerful, beneath forests and mountains and the quiet towns we believe we understand, there are doors that were never supposed to be opened. Gene Hackman stood watch over one of those doors for decades. He structured his entire existence around it. The walls, the cameras, the silence, the legal agreements, the staff that disappeared, the absolute isolation. He carried that weight from the height of his career all the way through his final days. He carried it through Oscars and press tours. He brought it with him into retirement, when he set aside acting in favor of painting and quiet novels. He carried it all the way into the final cold week of his life, sitting alone inside his fortress, with his wife's body beside him, making the deliberate choice not to reach for the phone. And now he is gone. The last living person who knew every corridor of that tunnel, every crate inside that chamber, every marking scratched into those walls, gone. And whatever remains behind that welded iron barrier 40 feet beneath his library is no longer his burden to carry. The question is not whether the FBI is aware of what lies down there. They are. The real question is, what could possibly be so dangerous, so destabilizing, so fundamentally threatening to everything we believe we understand about this world, that they would rather say nothing at all than reveal to the public what they discovered behind that door. What do you think is actually down there? Was Hackman the final guardian of something buried long before he ever drew breath? Or was he its last prisoner, serving out a sentence he inherited the moment he first turned that key? Leave your theory in the comments, because I genuinely read every single one of them. And if you want to be here the instant the next piece of this story surfaces, hit that subscribe button before you scroll on. Somewhere behind an iron door, out in the New Mexico desert, something is still sitting there, still waiting. It has waited through wars, through presidencies, through the rise and collapse of empires that once believed themselves permanent. It waited quietly beneath the boots of the men who assembled the atomic bomb just a few miles up the road. It waited under the tires of every unmarked vehicle that rolled up that driveway after midnight. It waited beneath one of the most instantly recognizable faces in American cinema for the better part of 30 years. And silence, as it turns out, has never once been the same thing as safety. I'll see you in the next one.